Hello. The purpose of this video is to introduce you to some of my research in big data and web scraping and to show you how you can get involved. So I'm going to share my screen here. And what I have pulled up on my screen is a web search engine that I've written. And it works similar to, say, Google or Bing, where you type in a search query, and then down here are search results related to that search term. What's a little bit different about this search engine, though, is this graph that gets displayed up here at top. And on the x-axis, you can see every year since 2000 up until the present year. And then the y-axis, this red line right here, represents the total fraction of news articles or web pages that were written in that year that mention whatever term it is that you're searching for. So here, I'm searching for President Trump, and it makes sense that between 2000 and, say, 2015, Trump, I mean, he was an important person, big businessman, but not in the national news all the time. But then in 2015, he announced his desire to run for presidency, and suddenly the news is talking about him all the time. And then eventually he gets elected president and inaugurated and is president for 4 years, and the news talks about him a lot during that period of time. So that kind of, this trend is maybe what we would expect of how much newspapers are talking about Trump. Let's compare this to two other presidents, President Obama and President Bush. And with this search engine, I can just type in those terms and it'll do this comparison for me. So there's Obama and Bush, and I do my search. And now each one of these terms is showing up as a different line in this graph. And so you can see we still have this red line for Trump, but now Obama is this green line. You can tell that from this label down here. And President Bush is this blue line. And you can see that, okay, so Bush was president from 2000 to 2008, and there's lots of articles talking about him at that point. But after he's not president anymore, relatively few articles are talking about him. Similarly, Obama's talked about a lot when he's president, but before his presidency and afterwards, people aren't really talking about him. So similar trends that we saw with President Trump. One of the things that I find really fascinating about this particular plot, though, is that if you look at Bush and Obama, slight difference in magnitudes here, but they're pretty much about the same. It's about 1% or so of news articles on any given day are talking about mentioning the president during their presidencies. But that's not the case for President Trump, that for him, it's roughly, say, 6% of news articles are talking about President Trump. And I think this gives us a good way to quantify how much more controversial Trump's presidency was than the previous two presidencies, that for whatever the reason is, people were just talking about him a lot more during his presidency. And so that's one of the sort of interesting things that you can find out with this tool. I want to show a few more examples of things that you can do. And here is a search for ISIS. And so ISIS, obviously the Middle Eastern governmental group, didn't exist before, say, 2014, but there were other things that kind of used that term, and so that's why you can see a few kind of bumps down over here. But then in 2014, the Middle Eastern group was created, and news started talking about them all the time, very dramatic news. And our tool here lets us pinpoint exactly when ISIS was created and when the news started covering them. It also would let us zoom in on exactly finding what were the first news articles about ISIS. And that's something that you can't really do with a traditional search engine, say like Google or Bing, that only consider the text of your search and don't let you zoom in on timeframes. So this is another cool thing that you can do with this search engine, is find out when a particular geopolitical event became important and go look at the news for that event at the start, at the source. One last example that I have is if we search for Iraq, the country. And here, what we see is this big kind of spike around 2003 up to, say, 2009. And this corresponds to the invasion of Iraq by US forces. And so before 2003, people were talking about Iraq a little bit, just because it's a important country in the world until people talk about it. But it really rose to prominence in English newspapers with the US invasion. And then as time wore on, you can see that the sort of the amount that people talked about Iraq and cared about Iraq kind of faded from the public consciousness. And that's for a number of reasons, but it's a clear downward trend over here. Something that I found really interesting from this plot, though, is this spike over here in mid-2014. And what this corresponds to, and I actually didn't realize this, but the US government had pulled out all of their troops from Iraq prior to 2014, but then President Obama decided that the security situation in Iraq was too fragile and new troops needed to be recommitted into Iraq. And that's what this was a very controversial decision doing that. And so that's what this spike corresponds to, is a bunch of news articles, blog posts, things like that that are talking about that surge in Iraq. And so this is like an event that if I was more politically aware beforehand, I could have known about, but I just didn't know about it when I was doing this search here and was able to discover it, important timelines that way. And my hope is that this tool is going to be useful for lots of researchers and lots of different domains, discovering how people interact on the web and how they used to interact on the web. What things did they used to talk about, and how has that changed over time? So in order to do that, there's a lot of computer science involved in order to make something like this happen. And one of the most important things is actually getting the correct ground truth data out of web pages. So here, in order to know that a web page or a news article was about Iraq, I had to be able to scrape that web page and look at all the words in the web page and find that, oh, it contains the word Iraq inside of it. Well, that part's actually not too hard, and I've already taken 100% care of that part of this task. Something that's a little bit harder, though, is that we also need to know what time the web page was published at. So it's currently 2021, and so if I have my web scraper going out and downloading web pages right now, I'm downloading them in 2021, but they could have been written long, long ago in the past. And say the New York Times, for example, has an archive of all of their articles that they've ever published down back into the 1800s available online. And it's important for us to be able to, given one of those articles, determine when was it actually published so that it can go into the appropriate column in a graph like this. And at this point, I have about 3,000 or 4,000 different domain names that this is able to work with, extracting the information out of them. So really popular things like New York Times and CNN, Fox News, Breitbart, things like that. But there's thousands and millions really of other domain names that I want to be able to do this with that I currently can't. And so that is like smaller blogs. It's really important to understand what's sort of the average person talking about instead of just what are journalists talking about. And it also includes, say, foreign language media. So I want to know not just what US newspapers are talking about Iraq, but I want to know, how did Chinese newspapers respond to the US invasion of Iraq? Did they continue talking about it for a long time? Do they still talk about it? Those are important questions that, at least at this point, aren't easy to answer for a researcher. So the first key research problem that I have, again, is extracting this information out of web pages. And I've built a tool in order to do this. This tool is called Meta HTML, and it's available as a GitHub library or GitHub repository that you can download and work with. And so in the next video, I'm going to talk about how to actually work with that tool, and then we'll talk about how to make it work, how to add support for other host names so that we can, and the purpose of that is so that these sorts of graphs right here are more accurate and cover, we can have more options in what we're searching for. So I'll see you in the next video.